Australia's effort to curb carbon emissions via the so-called safeguard mechanism came into effect on the 1st of July. How will these guidelines impact both companies and their investors? Dilan Ashton from Equity Trustees Asset Management joins us now to discuss. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. So we have had this mechanism come into place a couple of weeks ago. What should investors know about how it could affect companies and obviously their bottom lines as well?
Yeah, thanks, Kyle, and thanks for having me. So look, basically, the reforms to the safeguard mechanism are a Australian government policy, and it basically regulates the emissions of some of Australia's largest polluters. So it essentially sets a limit or a baseline on the amount that these high emitting facilities are able to emit, and those facilities must keep their emissions below the baseline or face increased compliance costs in the form of purchasing carbon credits. So it's not new. It's actually been around since 2016, and it was implemented by the Abbott government, but it was controversial back then because baselines were set at such high levels that it didn't actually do much to bring company emissions down, and in fact they actually increased over the time. So the reforms are really important in bringing our emissions down in line with our legislated policy. And just for some context, the emissions covered under the mechanism represent around 28% of Australia's total emissions. So the aim is to bring those emissions down for those facilities by 30% by 2030, and it will make a huge impact.
So again, just the investment implications here, I suppose. I mean, you know, there's a sort of a lot of dynamic things, especially when it comes to, for lack of a better phrase, sort of the ESG element to things, and you know, even just from basic reporting and getting used to sort of new guidelines around that. An abundance of information, but I mean, what are the core things that even just a novice investor will have to consider from these changes that might be something that has to be an input, if you will, into their sort of calculus in the future?
Yeah, I think there are probably two key areas of the reforms that need to be considered. So the first is around baselines, where they'll be set and how they'll be reduced moving forward. And the second is around carbon pricing. So in terms of where baselines will be set, we actually don't know that yet. And that's information that will be released by the government in the very near future, and something we'll be keeping an eye out for. But what we do know is that these baselines are going to reduce by 4.9% per year, and they'll also move towards industry averages. So what that means is, in the earlier years, we are expecting that there won't be too much of an impact on companies because the baselines will be set at around the area that they're already emitting. But we will see those baselines decline as we push out to 2030. And that means that companies that aren't keeping pace with their decarbonisation plans and keeping pace with those declines will be impacted from a cost perspective. And then the second, around carbon pricing, is that there is a little bit more clarity now. Companies that are able to keep their emissions below the baseline will be rewarded with the ability to generate carbon safeguard mechanism credits, and they'll be able to trade those credits, and they'll also be able to be banked for future years. And in addition, the government has provided a little bit more clarity on carbon pricing by setting, I guess, a cap of $75 per tonne, which will increase by CPI plus 2% out to 2030. So still looking to see where the baselines will be set for each individual facility, which will be really important.
So also a consideration, I mean, is there sort of punitive risks, if you will, that if companies aren't compliant, they could get sort of slapped on the wrist, so to speak? The comparison that I think of is, a financial institution, proving not compliant with, say, capital ratios or whatever it happens to be, and then being sort of slapped with a fine or, an increased capital requirement for the business to be able to sort of pay their dues. I mean, for companies going forward and investors looking for risk management, is there the possibility of always having to consider these potentially punitive measures if corporates aren't compliant?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess the key reason for these reforms is for it to have an impact on climate policy. So companies will be penalised for not complying. They'll be penalised pretty significantly. So it would be in their best interest to comply with the policy. But there's probably around 215 facilities that will be impacted by these reforms. And around 50% of the emissions covered under the safeguard mechanism do belong to ASX listed companies. So there's over 30 companies in the market that will be impacted by the reforms, and it's something that's investors are really keeping an eye on, although different sectors will be impacted in different ways. But it does cover a broad range of sectors like oil and gas, manufacturing, resources, construction and transport. So, we will be watching each of these sectors on how they look to speed up their decarbonisation plans and keep pace with the regulation. And in addition, it's companies like BHP, Rio, South32, Woodside and Santos, those heavy emitting companies that we'll be keeping a close eye on.
And let's just talk about some of those specific companies now, if we may, because you have provided a list here, and while a lot of them are ones that would appear in many people's portfolios. So, I mean, what are the stocks that we have to watch?
Look, it's in terms of the earlier years, the impact from a cost perspective, we don't think will be too great. So the mechanism does allow a lot of these companies a few years to get their decarbonisation plans in check. It's towards the back end of the decade that we will start to see the impact. But to flag a company that are doing quite well in their decarbonisation plan is BHP. So they released their update just last month, actually, and they did note that they're tracking quite well towards their 2030 target and also towards their 2050 target. They have been able to reduce their operational emissions by 24% in the last 2 years. And that's been largely done by switching to renewables, and actually at their Chile operations, at their copper mines, they've actually switched to 100% renewables. So they're doing a great job. They flagged a spend of around $4 billion, mostly flagged for the back end of the decade. But that will go towards achieving their decarbonisation goals. But you can expect that the companies within the oil and gas sector will be mostly impacted. But again, it'll be towards the back end of the decade, and we'll be watching how they keep pace with the regulation over the next few years.